I produced a video not too long ago, well, probably about a month ago now, on the subject of Bond Street Station. Something a couple of people pointed out is that while there is a Bond Street Station, there is no Bond Street. Which is true, in a manner of speaking. There is no street in the area of the station called Bond Street. What there is a new Bond Street and an old Bond Street. So why is the station named after a street that doesn't technically exist? Well, because Bond Street is, you might say, a brand rather than a place. Let's go back, way back to the 17th century. At that time, the West End was a very literal thing. It was the westernmost reach of London. Places like Hammersmith and Kensington were villages out in the sticks. The main attraction in the area around what's now Bond Street was a fair held near the beginning of summer, a May Fair, if you will. Wait a second, do you think that's where the name Mayfair comes from? In the 17th century, this was an attractive place to build big houses for the upper classes, being upwind and upriver of the industries in the east and a reasonable distance from poor people, but also close enough to Westminster and the city. One of the largest and most impressive mansions that sprung up here was Clarendon House, built for the Earl of Clarendon and later sold to the Duke of Albemarle. A decline in fortunes, not least caused by his ownership of Clarendon House, prompted the Duke to sell up in 1683. His estate was bought by a wealthy consortium which included one Thomas Bond. And yes, he was a relative of James, according to Ian Fleming. The consortium decided the real profit in their investment lay in knocking the house down and building the area up with houses and shops that were smaller but nevertheless still pretty pricey. The consortium named several of the streets after themselves. Bond Street was one of those. Bond Street occupied the area that is now Old Bond Street and was completed in 1686. Other landowners saw the success of Bond Street and its neighbours and wanted in. In the 1720s, the street was extended up towards Oxford Street, and this extension was officially known as New Bond Street. It's the one that's nearer to the tube station. The existence of a new Bond Street, of course, implies an old Bond Street. So the original was renamed. Despite this, these two streets are collectively known to the general public just as Bond Street. Often in London, and indeed in any city, the name of a place becomes shorthand for the kind of business conducted there. If you say, he works in Westminster, people will assume you mean he works for the government. Or if you say, she's in the city, it implies she's in finance. Mayfair is shorthand for wealth, and Bond Street is shorthand for luxury goods. Now look, I'll be honest, I don't have much time for Bond Street. It's my firm opinion that most of the stuff they sell there is primarily the kind of stupid things that rich people buy to show that they're rich. But while I might be bitter because I'm a YouTuber who makes videos about trains and will therefore never be rich, the fact is that Bond Street didn't get this way because of gentrification or regeneration. It's always been like this. Mayfair was a wealthy area, and so the shops, houses and other businesses that went up here quickly adapted to that market through the century. For the first time, shopping went from a necessity that should be performed by servants only to a leisure activity. The streets had pavements, which was rare in the 18th century and meant that the wealthy could walk up and down without getting covered in mud and poo. All of this added up to a fashionable district where one went to see and be seen, as they say. By the beginning of the 19th century, this place came to symbolise all that was best and worst about Regency Britain. A subculture known as the Bond Street Loungers grew up, young men eager to show off with their high fashion and funny walk, taking up the pavement and occasionally getting shot at by the deranged Thomas Pitt. Beau Brummell, essentially the inventor of modern men's fashion, was a regular customer at the tailors along here. The Prince Regent lost vast sums gambling here. And Lord Nelson seems to have been a particular fan, judging by the 2 blue plaques dedicated to him. And so, Bond Streets, old and new, have remained. The shops are now high-end boutiques owned by multinational companies, and the customers are more likely to be new money than aristocrats, but substantially it's changed little over the past 300 years. When the Central London Railway built their station there in 1900, Harry Selfridge tried to persuade them to name it after his department store. But really, Bond Street was too much of a draw. In the 1920s, it was even considered to make the collective name for the streets official, but the locals objected. And I can kind of see why you might. Even though there's technically no street by that name, everyone knows Bond Street. Well, I hope you enjoyed this high-end tale from the tube. If you did, please do click the like button, and you may also enjoy subscribing for more. I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the price tag to my handbag. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.